You were never meant to hear this. In a quiet English town, beneath the sound of Sunday church bells and the illusion of order, something tore open a doorway between life and death and left it ajar. The Pollock case is remembered as a curiosity, a paranormal riddle for late-night radio hosts. But that is a lie. What happened in Hexham was not folklore, not misremembered grief, not coincidence. It was a fracture in the story we are told about who controls the soul and whether the soul is ever allowed to escape. What you are about to hear is dangerous not because it's superstition, but because once you understand it, you will never look at your own reflection the same way again. May 5, 1957. 3 children walked happily towards Sunday service. Within minutes, 2 of them would be gone forever. Joanna, age 11, dreamer, caretaker, artist. Jacqueline, age 6, her shadow, her mimic, her mirror. Their dresses still clean, their voices still bright. Then steel and glass shredded through the morning. Tires screeched, bone cracked, and blood sprayed across the cobblestones. Witnesses swore the driver aimed for them, like a hunter steering into prey. And in an instant, the 2 sisters were no longer of this earth. Their parents John and Florence collapsed beneath the weight of grief. Their world turned into silence. The town tried to console them, but Hexham itself seemed to shiver, as if the very stones of the street remembered. But here is the fracture. 18 months later, Florence gave birth to twins. Twins, something no doctor had predicted, no family history could explain. They were named Jillian and Jennifer. They arrived as infants, but carried scars, knowledge, and voices that belonged to the dead. Identical marks on Jennifer's head and hip matched Jacqueline's scar and birthmark exactly. And when the girls learned to speak, they spoke of toys they had never owned, of streets they had never walked, of deaths they could not possibly have known. Understand what this means. It means that memory identity itself can slip through death like smoke through a keyhole. It means the walls around our minds are thinner than we are told. And it means that someone, somewhere, has always known this truth and chosen to bury it. This is not just a ghost story. It is a rupture in the system of control. And once you hear the whole descent, you cannot unhear it. The official story calls it coincidence, a fluke of genetics, a trick of suggestion. But ask yourself this: how does coincidence carve scars into the flesh of a newborn child, in the exact same place as a dead sister's wound? How does chance implant knowledge of toys hidden away in an attic, locked since the funeral, untouched for years yet instantly recognized by children who should have had no way of knowing? The Pollock twins did not inherit memories. They carried imprints, as if their bodies were the parchment for someone else's unfinished story. From the moment they could walk, the new girls seemed to step directly into the lives of the dead. Jillian and Jennifer asked for dolls that belonged to Joanna and Jacqueline, dolls they had never seen. They insisted on visiting a park they had never been to but described it in perfect detail, right down to the swings. When a family moved furniture from one town to another, the twins cried out, naming streets they had never walked, mourning the loss of a home they had never lived in. Their parents stood paralyzed, torn between awe and fear. Florence, grounded in her faith, whispered that it was blasphemy. John, haunted by his secret belief in reincarnation, whispered something darker, that perhaps God had not been the one to answer his prayers. You see, institutions teach us that identity is simple. You are born, you live, you die, and then silence. But cases like this tear holes in that script. If identity can be carried over, then what else is smuggled through? Trauma? Obsession? Manipulation? What if death is not an ending, but a migration? And what if someone, somewhere, has always been guiding the traffic? Because here's the secret no one dares to say aloud. Reincarnation has never been about comforting souls or karmic balance. Across cultures, from the Tibetan Book of the Dead to the suppressed teachings of early Christianity, it was treated as a prison cycle, a wheel, a mechanism to recycle consciousness. And if that wheel exists, then there must be hands that spin it. The Pollock case is not merely about 2 sisters returned, it's about the machinery of souls exposed, even if just for a moment, like the gears of a watch when the glass cracks. The twins grew, the memories persisted, And what terrified researchers most was not that children could recall past lives, it was that their memories seemed sharper, clearer, more unshakable than the living around them. Which forces the question, who really owns your memories? You, or the system that implants them? Most men live their whole lives believing their minds are fortresses sealed, private, untouchable. But what if the Pollock case is not an exception, but a leak? A hairline fracture revealing a network far older and darker than anything taught in schools. Look at the pattern. 2 girls die violently, their deaths saturating the town in grief. 18 months later, 2 new lives appear carrying not only the scars but the unfinished narratives of the dead. This is not chance. This is transfer. In the early files of Dr. Ian Stevenson, the psychiatrist who risked his reputation to document over 2,500 cases like this, you find a single recurring word scribbled in margins. Imprint. It's a word used in behavioral science, in intelligence programs, in trauma-based conditioning. It is the mark left when an event is so intense that it burns itself onto a nervous system, ready to be reloaded. And where there is imprinting, there can be engineering. The Pollock twins weren't just evidence of survival after death, they were evidence of the soul's vulnerability to programming. Pause and notice the timing, the accident, the trauma, the father's obsessive prayers focused, repeated, like a ritual. In occult systems and in certain classified projects, ritual focus is the key to binding an outcome. In other words, John may have unwittingly performed the perfect summoning and emotional technology older than temples, older than kings. Florence called it blasphemy. John called it faith. But at its core it was an invocation. And the result? 2 vessels, carrying 2 unfinished lives, born into a world still drenched in grief and expectation. This is where the story becomes dangerous for you, the listener. Because the moment you understand that consciousness can be transferred, you must ask who is doing the transferring now. If memory, trauma, and even identity itself can be moved like files between hard drives, then you are not just a person. You are a data set, a system, a resource. And this is why these cases are downplayed as mysteries instead of what they truly are: breaches. Breaches in a control grid as old as civilization. Breaches that reveal how elites have always recycled not only wealth and bloodlines but something far more valuable: experience. What you're hearing now isn't myth. It's a manual, and by listening, you're already stepping beyond the velvet ropes. The Pollock case is the doorway, but once you step through it, you start seeing the pattern everywhere, etched into history, myth, religion, and even government programs hidden behind antiseptic names. The blueprint of the system is not etched on stone tablets. It's encoded in ritual, repetition, and shock. Every culture has its version. The wheel of samsara, the river Lethe, the doctrine of purgatory. All of them describe cycles' movement without escape. But what's never taught publicly is that cycles can be weaponized. Think about the timing and conditions around the Pollock twins. Intense trauma at the point of death, unresolved identities, an emotionally charged environment, and a father's obsessive focus acting as a ritual anchor. That is not superstition. That is a formula. In psychological warfare manuals, the same ingredients are listed for identity reformation: trauma plus isolation plus repetition plus emotional anchors. In occult texts, it's called binding. In black budget labs, it's called conditioning. Different words, same mechanism. And this is why institutions react with ridicule and suppression whenever a case like this surfaces. Because the very idea of reincarnation undercuts their monopoly on narrative. If you can carry memories through lifetimes, then the nation, the church, the corporation no longer owns you. You no longer begin as a blank slate. Their propaganda fails, their indoctrination cracks. But if they can interfere with the cycle, nudge it, redirect it, imprint it, they don't just control your life. They control your return. Look at elite bloodlines, dynasties, secret societies. Why the obsession with blood rituals, succession rites, initiation oaths? They are not simply preserving wealth. They are preserving continuity, like keeping a signal strong between transmissions. Publicly, it's called tradition. Privately, it's continuity of consciousness. This is the hidden system the Pollock case exposed. Not a ghost story, but a glitch. Not two girls reborn, but two signals spilling out of their assigned channels, showing us how the current works. And just as quickly, academia moved to muffle it, to bury it under coincidence, parental suggestion, childhood imagination. But a question remains, gnawing at the edges of your mind. If the Pollock twins are a leak, how many others have been guided perfectly, their past erased, their memories sealed, their lives rerouted before birth? This is where the descent stops being a story and becomes a mirror. You are starting to see it now. The cracks aren't random. They're markers. And when you line up the markers across time, a map begins to emerge. Not of roads or rivers, but of power. Power that flows from lifetime to lifetime, hidden in plain sight, passed like a torch while the rest of the world forgets who they are. The Pollock twins were an accident. The system itself is not. Go back far enough and every major civilization had its own custodians of the cycle. In Egypt, the priests of Ammonius controlled the afterlife texts, the weighing of the soul, and the secret names of the gods. In Babylon, kings underwent ritual death and rebirth during the Akitu festival to renew their divine right to rule. In Greece, the Eleusinian mysteries promised initiates a form of immortality knowledge encoded in trance, death and rebirth ceremonies, and the ingestion of substances designed to fracture the barrier between lives. And in Tibet, the search for reincarnated lamas, especially the Dalai Lama, is not a quaint religious custom. It's an institutionalized hunt for continuity, to locate and retrieve the same consciousness, again and again, before it drifts too far from the network. Everywhere you look, the pattern holds. Trauma, ritual, secrecy, continuity. A cycle of return. And where there's continuity, there's control. The hidden power isn't just wealth or armies. It's memory identity itself. Imagine an elite who dies, but is reborn with fragments of his past life knowledge, reintroduced into his own network, mentored, groomed, and activated. Imagine a bloodline that doesn't just preserve DNA but the consciousness riding it. The public sees privilege. The initiated see persistence. Even the symbols around you whisper the same story. Ouroboros the snake eating its own tail. Phoenix rising from its ashes. Resurrection, rebirth, baptism, initiation. These are not metaphors. They are instruction manuals written in code. And the Pollock twins? They're like a signal bleed from the hidden channel. An unplanned rebroadcast of the same mechanism used for centuries to maintain control. And here is where this stops being trivia. Because if these leaks exist, then someone somewhere monitors them. Someone tries to plug them. Someone wants to make sure you never realize the cycle isn't yours. Pause. Breathe. Feel what is stirring in you right now. The unease. The fascination. That's not fear, it's recognition. You're starting to remember that you've been here before. The ancients hid their cycle technologies inside temples and myths. Today, they hide them inside laboratories and programs with names so bland you'd never suspect their purpose. But the blueprint hasn't changed, only the language. What priests once called rites of passage, governments now call behavioral modification. What the mysteries called rebirth, think tanks call reprogramming. And what was once a secret sacrament is now an industry, a weapon, a market. Think about the mechanics. Trauma plus isolation plus repetition plus emotional anchor. In ancient rites, initiates were stripped, starved, frightened, plunged into darkness, then reborn into a new identity loyal to the cult. In modern systems, recruits are broken down in boot camps, black sites, cult compounds, even corporate training programs, then rebuilt as obedient components of a larger design. The body is the temple. The nervous system is the altar. The imprint is the sacrament. It is no coincidence that the CIA's most infamous mind control project, MKUltra, began in the 1950s, the very decade when the Pollock case broke open. Beneath its clinical language, behavioral engineering, memory erasure, personality fragmentation, is the same ancient formula. The goal wasn't just to control minds in life, but to study how far memory can be broken, split, or overwritten. What if the final phase wasn't erasing a man's mind, but learning how to steer his return? Every advertising algorithm, every social media feedback loop, every trauma-based news cycle you consume is a micro-initiation, a fractal of the same process. Shock, repetition, reward, imprint. Each time you scroll, click, and react, the system learns your emotional anchors. It learns how to rewrite you. And if you die tomorrow, the data doesn't. It waits like a seed. The Pollock twins weren't just a case of survival after death, they were a leak of continuity. The same continuity these systems now study, monetize, and weaponize. What priests once did in candle-lit chambers, executives now do with machine learning. Stop and realize, this isn't paranoia. It's a pattern. You've felt it. You've lived it. The cycle is not just a mystical wheel, it's an operating system. And the only question that matters now is whether you will run as a default program or wake up and rewrite your own code. At this point in the video, tell me in the comments, I break the cycle. I break the cycle. Type it twice. It's not just a phrase. It's a signal to yourself, to the algorithm, to the part of you that refuses to be recycled without your consent. There have always been men who sensed the bars of the cage even if they couldn't see them. Men who felt a pressure, a hum, a presence behind the curtain of history. They weren't saints. They weren't always pure. But they were awake enough to reach for the lock. And every time one of them pushed too far, the system moved to erase, distort, or consume him. Look back at the records that survive the fragments, the whispers. Pythagoras didn't just teach maths. He taught transmigration of souls as a science, not a religion. His inner circle was bound by oaths of secrecy, for breaking them meant death. Jordanian Bruno, a Dominican friar, openly wrote that consciousness is eternal and moves from star to star, life to life. He was burned at the stake not for astronomy, but for breaking the doctrine of finality. Hypatia of Alexandria taught that memory could be cultivated across incarnations through a disciplined life of philosophy and ritual. She was butchered by a mob sent by a jealous bishop. Closer to our time, Nikola Tesla spoke of the Akashic field and hinted that inventions appear fully formed because they're remembered, not imagined. He died in a hotel room surrounded by seized papers. G.I. Gurdjieff traveled from monastery to monastery, studying secret schools that claimed to wake a man between lives. His teachings were ridiculed, his writings mutilated. Ian Stevenson, the quiet psychiatrist who documented the Pollock twins and thousands of other cases, was mocked by colleagues and forced into the margins of academia, even as his evidence mounted. These men cracked the cycle not completely, but enough to glimpse its gears, enough to begin remembering themselves. And the system did what it always does: ridicule first, then isolation, then obliteration or appropriation. Because a man who remembers he is more than a single lifetime is dangerous. He is no longer easy to frighten, to bribe, to break. This is the price of seeing clearly. When you reach for the bars, they tighten. When you speak of the bars, you're silenced. But even fragments of their knowledge survive like hidden passwords left for those who dare to search. And now you, hearing this, feel the echo. You feel the old names stirring like sparks in the dark. This is not nostalgia. This is the beginning of recognition. Once you begin to notice the cracks, you start seeing the passwords everywhere, not on glowing screens or in secret vaults, but right in front of you, hiding in plain sight. The cycle hides its own keys. Symbols, phrases, rituals, numbers, even children's rhymes, things you've dismissed as trivial, are often coded instructions for those who know how to look. It's how knowledge survives when the teachers are burned and the libraries destroyed. Walk through any major city and count the serpents eating their tails, the checkerboard floors underfoot, the twin pillars at the entrances of government buildings. These are not aesthetic flourishes. They're continuity markers. The Ouroboros, the cycle of death and rebirth, the repetition of duality, these patterns are older than the institutions they decorate. Every time you pass through them unaware, you reaffirm your sleep. Every time you pass through them awake, you reaffirm your choice. Listen to the language of power. Initiative. Stakeholder. Reset. Legacy. Words chosen with surgical precision to echo ancient rites. Notice how the most elite schools and fraternities initiate their members with mock deaths, blindfolds, whispered oaths. Notice how mass culture recycles archetypes: hero dies, hero returns, hero reborn stronger, as if rehearsing you for a program you're not supposed to remember. The fragments also live in numbers. 3s, 7s, 11s, 12s, each tied to stages of a rite or to astrological timings long before clocks existed. Why do corporate logos echo sigils? Why do military operations use code names that sound like myths? Because the pattern keeps the cycle humming, and those who know the pattern surf it like a current instead of being dragged by it. This isn't superstition. It's operational security. When knowledge becomes too dangerous to teach openly, you disguise it as art, architecture, ceremony. You bury it inside the system you're hiding it from. That's why the Pollock case wasn't an anomaly but a flare, a visible glitch showing the mechanism at work. That's why suppressed truths always leave breadcrumbs. And now you are seeing them. You're reading the code behind the wallpaper. You're starting to understand that every time you dismiss something as just tradition, just coincidence, just entertainment, you're looking directly at a lock without knowing it. This is the moment where the story stops being a curiosity and becomes a weapon you can wield. The Pollock twins show you the mechanism. The symbols and passwords show you the doorways. Now you need the discipline to step through. Because continuity isn't an accident. It's a practice. And every practice begins with perception. First, you must train yourself to see. Strip away the noise. Walk through your own environment as if you've never seen it before. Ask why the architecture around you repeats the same forms. Ask why certain numbers and colors recur in your daily feeds, in brands, in headlines. Ask why your emotions are triggered in predictable cycles by the news, by entertainment, by seasons of ritualized spectacle. Each of these is an imprint point and anchor. Awareness begins to unhook them. Second, reclaim your attention. Every cycle needs energy to spin. In ancient rites, the initiate's focus was broken and then refocused on the cult symbol. In modern systems, your focus is broken by endless scrolling, fragmented attention, outrage on demand. Every click, every spike of emotion is a data point used to script your next reaction. Begin by withdrawing that energy. Choose what you consume. Choose when you consume it. Choose silence deliberately. This is not withdrawal, it's reconnaissance. Third, encode your own signals. Just as initiates used oaths and symbols to remember across lives, you can plant messages for yourself. A phrase, a ritual at sunrise, a mark hidden in a journal, something that jolts you out of the trance when you see it again, something that tells you, I have been here before, I chose to return awake. And finally, understand that this is not about superstition. It's about neurobiology and consciousness. Trauma imprints. Repetition shapes pathways. Symbols trigger memory. These are not beliefs, they are mechanics. The same mechanics priests used, that governments use, that algorithms use right now. Once you see the mechanics, you can use them for yourself. You can create continuity of will instead of continuity of programming. This is what the Pollock twins unknowingly revealed, that identity is portable, imprintable, malleable. The question isn't whether you will be imprinted. The question is by whom and whether you choose to become the author of your own return. Awakening is not a hobby. It's not a weekend thrill ride or an edgy podcast topic. It's a fracture in the life you thought was yours. And once it begins, it doesn't stop. This is the hidden cost, the one the system counts on you never discovering until it's too late. Because the moment you start to decode the cycle starts to decode you. The first cost is isolation. The more you see, the less you can unsee. Friends and family will still talk about sports, shows, the surface of things, while you're staring at the architecture behind their words. It's like watching a puppet show after you've seen the strings. You can still sit in the audience, but you're no longer fooled. This is why the men we spoke of, Bruno, Hypatia, Stevenson, ended up mocked, exiled, murdered. Not because they were wrong, but because they refused to be silent once they saw. The second cost is interference. Systems don't need to assassinate everyone who wakes up. All they need to do is bury you under noise, discredit you, drain your energy. Algorithms will suddenly push you content designed to hook you back into anger, despair, distraction. You'll find yourself exhausted, unable to focus, doubting what you saw. This isn't magic, it's mechanics. a feedback loop designed to reseal the cracks. The third cost is responsibility. Once you recognize the wheel, you can no longer blame anyone else for your spin. Every choice, every reaction, every habit becomes an act of programming or deprogramming. There's no savior, no guru to do it for you. You become your own initiator, your own priest, your own engineer. And that's terrifying for a mind raised to obey. And the final cost? Power. Because once you start to stabilize your continuity, to hold memory, to anchor attention, to encode your own signals, you become harder to steer. And systems are built to steer. When they can't, they push back. Not always violently. Sometimes with opportunities, seductions, rewards. A velvet cage instead of an iron one. Anything to get you to lay your tools down and forget. This is why the system fights so hard to keep you asleep. Not because you might overthrow it overnight, but because one man remembering himself is already a crack in the dam. And cracks spread. Cracks look harmless, tiny, hairline, easy to ignore. But every collapse begins this way. One fissure, then another, then a network of stress lines spider webbing through what seemed immovable. That's what awakening is. Not a single man screaming in the wilderness, but a quiet contagion of sight spreading through those who were meant to remain blind. It doesn't look like a revolution. It looks like men quietly withdrawing their consent to be programmed, one by one. And that is the system's nightmare. History leaves faint footprints of this phenomenon. Whole sects vanishing underground after their initiations were outlawed. Peasant uprisings mysteriously organized without leaders or manifestos, moving as if directed by an unseen signal. Soldiers on battlefields suddenly laying down arms, sensing some unspoken recognition in their enemies. These are not accidents. They're fractures, men remembering, if only for a moment, that they are not separate, that their identities have been manipulated, cycled, weaponized. And for that heartbeat of continuity, the wheel stops turning. This is why power structures focus not on destroying individuals, but on maintaining mass trance. Bread and circuses, endless screens, ritualized outrage, debt and reward, labels, flags, hashtags, scapegoats, anything to keep you spinning in your designated lane, to keep the cracks from connecting. Because once cracks link, a lattice forms, and a lattice becomes a network, and a network becomes a current strong enough to short-circuit the whole grid. Understand, the Pollock case was a signal leak. You listening to this now is another. Every time one of you recognizes a pattern, questions a narrative, breaks an imprint, a hairline fracture appears. And each fracture weakens the control structure's most valuable illusion, inevitability. The danger for you is not that they'll drag you into a dungeon. It's that they'll convince you you're crazy, alone, futile. They'll drown you in noise until you stop feeling the others. But you're not alone. Men are already finding each other quietly, invisibly outside the cycle. No leaders, no logos, just recognition. And that's how it starts. Not with a riot, not with a banner, with a signal, with a phrase, with a man remembering himself, then another, until the lattice hums with continuity. Outside the cycle, life does not look like escape to a cave or an off-grid hermitage. It looks, at first glance, utterly ordinary work, friendships, a body, a home. The difference is interior. A man in continuity lives deliberately. His attention is not a commodity. His memory is not outsourced. His reactions are not scripted. Every action he takes, even small ones, becomes an act of authorship rather than compliance. He wakes without reaching for a screen. He knows the first 15 minutes of his day are an imprinting zone, so he uses them to orient. Breath, silence, a phrase of his choosing. He moves through spaces, offices, trains, markets without slipping into trance. Symbols still appear around him, but they no longer hypnotize. They register as data points, as background code, and he chooses what, if anything, to do with them. He manages his emotional cycles as a craftsman manages tools. Outrage doesn't grab him on schedule. Pleasure doesn't anesthetize him on cue. He can still feel deeply anger, grief, joy, but he feels from choice rather than trigger. This isn't apathy. It's freedom of motion. It's a nervous system no longer being jerked like a marionette. He also leaves traces for himself, like the initiates of old. A symbol in a notebook, a ritual at sunset, a question scrawled on a wall where only he will notice it months later. These are continuity anchors' ways of remembering his own authorship, even when the world around him tries to erode it. And perhaps most importantly, he recognizes others, not as recruits or disciples but as fellow authors. A glance on a subway, a phrase in a conversation, a message buried in art. These are the micro-signals of a quiet fraternity of continuity. No banners, no leaders, no dogma. Just a living network of men and women writing their own scripts, weaving a new pattern from inside the old. From the outside, nothing seems to change. From the inside, everything is different. The cycle still spins, but you're no longer nailed to it. You're standing beside it, watching, deciding when and how to engage. This is what life in continuity actually looks like, not rebellion, but sovereignty. A single man living in continuity doesn't topple empires. He doesn't storm parliaments or burn temples. He simply stops feeding the wheel. And that, in time, is more corrosive to the cycle than any revolution. Because the cycle requires participation. It needs your outrage, your distraction, your obedience, your forgetting. Remove that fuel and the machinery begins to shudder. The destabilization is subtle at first. The man in continuity is harder to manipulate, so he consumes less of the narratives designed to guide him. His refusal spreads silently. He won't hate who he's told to hate, won't buy what he's told to buy, won't worship what he's told to worship. His absence creates ripples. An algorithm finds less traction, a slogan falls flat, a ritual loses a little of its charge. Multiply that by dozens, then hundreds, then thousands, and the cracks begin to widen. The system adapts, of course it always has. When one tool of control fails, another is deployed. But every adaptation consumes energy. Every failed imprint, every broken trigger, every moment of unexpected resistance forces the system to reveal itself a little more. And with each revelation, more eyes open, more cracks form. The lattice strengthens. What emerges isn't chaos but choice. A parallel script begins to take shape, quiet networks of men and women coordinating without central orders, commerce that ignores sanctioned channels, art that encodes memory instead of anesthesia. These aren't revolutions in the old sense. They're migrations away from the wheel into something uncharted. The Pollock Twins hinted at this possibility. Continuity that bypasses the sanctioned cycle. If identity and memory can be transferred, carried, recalled, then the entire premise of control collapses. Death, fear, debt, obedience, these lose their teeth when continuity is chosen instead of imposed. And that choice doesn't just free individuals. It destabilizes the architecture built on their forgetfulness. That's the future opening now. Not an apocalypse, but an unveiling. Not the end of the world, but the end of this world, the one designed to keep you cycling. The new one isn't guaranteed. It has to be authored. But for the first time in millennia, authors are waking up. The cycle does not die quietly. It is not some fading superstition that vanishes with the dawn of reason. It is engineered, adaptive, reactive, predatory. When continuity spreads, when cracks multiply, the system recognizes threat. And what it cannot seduce, it seeks to crush. This is where the confrontation begins. You'll see it in the sudden intensification of noise, the flood of meaningless entertainment, the acceleration of distraction, the amplification of division. You'll feel it in the air itself, the tightening of regulations, the narrowing of acceptable speech, the suffocating insistence that all eyes face the same direction. These are not accidents. These are reflexes, the wheel tightening its grip because it feels men slipping free of its pull. But the man in continuity cannot be reabsorbed so easily. His memory is not just personal, it is archaeological. He recalls the scars of history, the broken promises of empires, the hidden scripts behind revolutions and reforms. He cannot be lulled by nostalgia because he remembers the manipulation that authored it. He cannot be weaponized by fear because he has already seen death and carried himself through it. To the cycle, he is poison. So the cycle turns to open confrontation. It attempts to erase continuity through ridicule, through isolation, through surgical violence. Paints the awakened as madmen, conspiracists, heretics. It exiles them from polite society. And yet, this reveals the system's hand more clearly than ever before. For when the cycle must attack its own participants, the illusion of benevolence fractures. What was once worshipped begins to look monstrous. This is the climax of every hidden war in history, the point where the system can no longer disguise itself as shepherd and must reveal itself as jailer. When it does, something irreversible happens. Men begin to see the cage not as protection, but as prison. And once seen, the bars can never vanish again. The Pollock twins are not just a curiosity of reincarnation, they are a signal flare. Proof that continuity exists, proof that the cycle is vulnerable, proof that memory cannot be wholly suppressed. Their very lives are a declaration of war, whether they knew it or not. A reminder that the machinery can be broken, and that the cost of silence is far greater than the cost of defiance. The confrontation has already begun. The only question that remains is whether you stand as fuel for the wheel, or as fracture in its spokes. There is a moment, once continuity seizes you, where return is no longer possible. You can pretend. You can go through motions, mouth the slogans, mimic the rituals. But deep inside you will know. You will carry the unbearable weight of memory, and it will burn against every attempt to make you small again. That is the final descent, not death, not destruction, but the permanent shattering of illusion. Continuity is destiny, because once you recall the fragments, once you feel the echo of lifetimes bleeding through your skin, you are no longer a man inside their system, you are a system unto yourself. You are no longer a servant of the wheel, you are a witness to its fraud. That awareness is freedom, but it is also exile. For the cycle cannot allow such memory to spread unchecked. It will strip you of comfort, deny you belonging, make war on your very perception of reality. That is the warning. The Pollock twins remind us of this in their innocence. Children who carried scars from lives they were never supposed to remember. Children who revealed cracks in a machinery that thrives on forgetting. Their case is not anomaly, it is revelation. A glimpse into the forbidden architecture of control, and the knowledge that some souls slip through the cracks despite every effort to erase them. But now you've seen it. You've walked with me through the wreckage of Hexham, through the scar tissue of history, through the design of cycles meant to keep men obedient and asleep. You've glimpsed how continuity survives, how fragments leak, how cracks spread. You know now that awakening is not safe, not simple, not convenient. It is costly, but it is also irreversible. Understand this. Once you've heard, you cannot unhear.